Whatever one. That's good.
Oh,
I noticed, I can't tell you how many times you come and sit down, about 10 minutes, you gotta get up and move,
Yeah.
somebody's, I can't see anything going on.
Yeah, we talked about it.
eating like this. Doesn't matter, I like egg.
Well, and we have the screen up now, so you can watch. And that helps. I mean, it's a solution.
If you don't fix it, I'm going to say.
Read it and I'm here all the time.
Well, we just started using live video on that screen since COVID. The screen has been down since as long as I've been here, if not longer, but it was just worse. Now we use it as an active.
We used to just be for tourists, that's a Torah meeting,
Right.
that was the original.
Sessions we have, yeah.
I've got noon.
You are live, Greg.
All right. Hello, everybody. Hello, Steve. Hello, Judy. I think Philip is making his way in as well.
And Margaret's gonna be.
Margaret said she was gonna try to make it and hope she does.
Spoke to her.
Yeah.
But she won't be the same, she'll.
No, which is perfectly fine.
Okay.
So I wanna jump right in because there's just so much stuff to learn and not enough time to learn it in. So I'm gonna try to move this forward quickly. Obviously, stop me whenever you want. I'm not gonna reiterate what Midrash is. We've covered that already. I'm gonna return us right to where we ended last week, which was this Midrash entitled The Refused Woman. And I think everyone in the room has a copy of the text. And for those of you who are on the screen, you can look at the slide deck. So we have this situation where a woman goes to the Beit Din asking for a get. She says to the sages, give me a get or I will leave. And they say to her, we cannot give you a get. We can only give it to a man. The man divorces. And she says, compel him. And he says, we can't compel him. If we do, then it's a get under duress. And then you think you're not married, but you really are. And you end up with mamzerim. By the way, I know she's not here to hear the reply, but last week, Marsha Hoffman asked about adoption in the ancient Near Eastern world. And I said, I know who to ask. And I was right. And I want to read to you the short answer from Dr. Christy Garraway, who is a professor of Bible at the Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, and was my teacher. She wrote, this is a long, the biblical text is relatively silent on adoption, also on marriage and divorce law. There was no law, but we have narratives. So there are adoption documents found all throughout the ancient Near East, in Mesopotamia and Syria and Egypt. And they tend to be in quote unquote exceptional cases because most people wouldn't have the wherewithal to hire a scribe to record the adoption, right? And her point was adoption was actually very, 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 very common and not at all documented.
It was common?
It was common, right? Family systems were broken up all the time and children were being pawned off on people all the time. But it was not commonly recorded because that was an expense that most families didn't have the wherewithal to pay for. It was very common. There was adopting as an adult to inherit, adopting as children in a social class, adopting children from a lower social class. You could adopt a poor family could adopt their child out into a richer family. There was adoptions in godparentage and other things. And as Christy said at the end, this was the short answer, ha, 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 ha. Then she said, I forgot one caveat. There is a reference in multiple places in the biblical text to bearing on one's knees or setting a child on the knee, like what Jacob did to Ephraim and Manasseh. And this was meant to be a ritual mirroring birth that was something like an adoption. And that Sarah hoped to be built up through Hagar and Rachel through Bilhah as well. So there is this notion that this idea of handmaidenship was also an element of adoption that was actually a lot more common than I surmised and that we all surmised. But I'm gonna take responsibility for this revision that it's a lot more common than we thought it was gonna be. But we don't know how common because it wasn't often recorded because that was too expensive. So a little side note. All right. So the woman who wants to get tells the Beit Din to give her a get. They say, no, we can't. And then she asked the carob tree to be uprooted, and then I'll take note. And then we looked at the story of the oven of Achnai, right? And we got to this point where the rabbis are debating whether or not this oven is kosher. And they have a moment where one of them asked the carob tree to move. And they said, what are you talking about? We don't listen to carob trees, okay? And then he asked the water in the stream, if the halakha is according to me, turn the water back in the stream. And they said, we don't cite the stream as a source of halakhic reasoning. And then they say to him about the walls of the Beit Midrash. If it's according to mine, let the walls of the Beit Midrash come tumbling down. And they say, we don't listen to the Beit Midrash walls, we only listen to the halakha, and the Beit Midrash walls stop in between, not falling down, not going up, in deference to both the rabbis. All right. Then Rabbi Eliezer says to them, this is the bottom paragraph on the slide, if the halakha is according to my opinion, heaven will prove it. And a bat kol, a heavenly voice, emerged from heaven and says, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer, as the halakha is in accordance with his opinion, every place that he has one? A voice from the heavens saying, Rabbi Eliezer is right. And Rabbi Yehoshua stood at his feet and says, it is not in heaven. Lo bashamayim he, we read in the book of Deuteronomy. What does that mean, the Gemara asks, if not in heaven, if not here, where else could it mean? And Rabbi Yirmiyah says, the Torah was already given at Sinai. We do not regard it as a divine voice. As you wrote at Sinai, in the Torah, a majority to incline. The people were there to listen. Since the majority of rabbis disagree with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, we had a majority listening in Mount Sinai. We have a majority of rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer. The halakha is not ruled in accordance with him, even if the bat kol, the voice of heaven, says it goes along with him. The Gemara says a later story. Years later, Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah the prophet and said to him, what did the Holy One of Blessing do at that moment when Rabbi Yehoshua issued his declaration that even the voice of heaven cannot overrule the majority of the rabbis in this instance? And Elijah the prophet, said that God smiled and said to himself, Nitzchuni banai, my children have triumphed over me, my children have triumphed over me. A very famous story, the purpose of which is this. If you study the history of constitutional law in this country, we know of the decision Marbury v. Madison, in which ruling the Supreme Court said that they get to decide what the law is. They get to decide whether or not a law passed by Congress is constitutional. They are the final decider of interpretation. It was a groundswell moment in the history of jurisprudence in this country. In this instance, what they're saying is, God gave us the words of Torah at Mount Sinai, and it was agreed to by a majority of those who were present. And ever since then, the authority to decide what the Torah means, following what it says, but what it means, the authority to do interpretation was given to the majority and not retained by God. So it's the rabbis in their halachic deciding that get to decide. And even if you have a voice from heaven saying the majority is wrong and this single rabbi is right, the opinion still goes with the majority. And that is why God laughed at God's self and said, my children have defeated me. My children, I have created a monster who has wrested authority out of my hands, and they get to decide. This is the famous story of the story of the Avan Machnai, that both the rabbis of the Beit Din and the woman wanting to get in the Midrash know. She is acting like Rabbi Eliezer. She is calling upon a carob tree to prove that she should be granted the get. Okay, so she's referring to that in this part. At that moment, a carob tree was uprooted. They continue. She says to them, if you won't follow what this carob tree says, if you won't grant me the gets, I am a living widow.
But she can't be married.
That is why that's the widow part of it. I am a living widow who cannot remarry. They said, it has already been said, it is better to dwell as two than to dwell as a widow. Whatever that is. She said to them, but my husband has done this and that to me. right? He is mistreating me in a myriad ways. He's repulsive to me. And I am not some captive to be bedded by someone I despise. And they said to her, who are we? So much lesser than our teachers to be so rash. We must follow the opinion of Rabbeinu Asher, who says that only men can give the get. And at that moment, in following with the story of the Avanachai, another miracle happens. The stream turned backwards, and they paid it no mind. She said, fine, annul my marriage, since he has done something improper to me. They said, we have no authority to annul the marriage. She said, abrogate my marriage as something that was a fraudulent conveyance. And I'm sorry for those at home, the Zooms, if I knew that he would do these things to me, I would not have consented to marry him in the first place. She's pulling out all the stops, all the different ways that the marriage can be concluded or ended, to exit herself from the marriage if she is able to. And they say, we cannot. At that moment, the walls of the study hall lean inward and begin to fall, and went on leaning and falling. And she said to them, a rabbinic court is the father of orphans, right? As a rabbinic court, you take responsibility for all the orphans. Am I not also an orphan in this instant? Am I not forlorn? Don't you have responsibility to look out for my well-being too? And they said to her, this isn't an argument. We do not hear your claims at all. This is a non-argument. Maybe, and now they're going to victim blame. Maybe he asked something of you and you refused him. She said, yes, he did. What he asked of me was a pile of conditions to get my gets. And I could not keep up with them. The only thing he's asked of me, she says, that I couldn't give him was the pile of conditions he put on to try to entice me to give him concessions before he gave the get. And now we have a box full. A divine voice emerges and calls out, what are you doing to this woman whose husband is repulsive to her? She does not have to give him a thing to obtain her get. Typo, thing, not think. And the sages said, it is not in heaven, and we pay no heed to a divine voice. Right, now remember, up to now, these rabbis, are they making things up?
As they go along? Yes.
So they are, what are they making up? What new law are they creating? What new principle are they following?
Saying that God doesn't rule everything that they do.
So Susan suggested that the rabbis are saying that God does not rule anymore, that they do. I'm agreeing with you that they say that, and I'm going to suggest that isn't new.
I don't think that they can actually believe that.
So I think that they can, because they're learning from the feet of the story of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua, right? Right? This is one of the foundational texts of the rabbinic tradition, that the majority of rabbis are the ultimate decisor, even over and above a heavenly voice.
Yes, the Beit Din.
That's the Beit Din, right? And they're the Beit Din, right? And if the Beit Din feels something like only men can give a get, it is not up to a single rabbi, or frankly, not up to a single generation of rabbis speaking as a Beit Din to overrule that overarching decision, even if they're inspired by a moving carob tree, streams flowing in the opposite direction, the walls of the Beit Midrash coming down, and a voice coming from the heavens saying, you're doing it wrong. They might be wrong, but their authority is what is most important to them. And if they go against the authority of the generations before, then they are going to cause the whole system to come crumbling down. And they stand to benefit the most from the system staying in place. So they're not doing anything new. They're doing what they've always done and applying it in this new situation. And the rabbis are afraid of doing things new. So here we are. The sages say it is not in heaven, and we pay no heed to a divine voice. At that moment, the Holy Blessed One wept and said, "My sons have triumphed over me. My sons have triumphed over me." The same ending is the story of the oven of Achnai. It's devastating. It's devastating.
Still true.
And in many ways still true. Especially in, and we know the plight of the agunot, and aguna is a chained woman, right? Another phrase of that living widow, right? Women who are chained to a husband, who have no desire to be married to them, either way, but refuse to give a gift. And, there are, in different communities, different levels of communal pressure. I mean, I give kudos to my colleague Rabbi Goldberg at Boca Raton Synagogue, who is often very outspoken about, in defense of women who are agonotes, and is not afraid of calling out an individual man for not giving a gift and ostracizing him within the community for his behavior.
Wasn't there something like that about 10 years ago with this community?
It happens. Yeah.
The rabbis got involved.
Yeah. And the thing is, unfortunately, one rabbi isn't enough. Right? You need all of the rabbis who this one person could turn to all turn their back on him, because if he can get his need met anywhere else, if he can find somewhere to go daven, then it doesn't work.
How many do you need?
What do you mean?
How many rabbis do you need to make this decision?
None. The rabbis can't make this decision. Only the husband can make this decision.
No, but I mean, can one
rabbis-
rabbi do a get with the husband's acceptance or not acceptance?
You need three rabbis.
That's-
You need three, well, let me rephrase. The typical custom for get giving these days, which are pragmatic and not legal, is a husband impanels a beit din of three rabbis to write and deliver the get on his behalf. And so in order to take the responsibility of the physical writing and delivering, what the custom typically is, a man will go to his beit din, say, "I am wanting to have a get delivered to my wife." That beit din would then have the get written. It would be delivered either by that beit din or to another beit din in the locality of the wife. And that beit din would deliver the get to the wife, as opposed to having a husband doing it by himself. In some of the early traditions, there were some questions about if you rely on personal liability, it may not be so. By having the beit din, you have an authority who's tracking the writing of the beit din. And the records are there to be kept of it, which is a good thing. So the man needs to go to a rabbi, but no panel of rabbis is gonna say no to that. But 3 rabbis, 300 rabbis, 3,000 rabbis can't make the man ask for it in the first place. And that's the problem.
I'm really having a problem with this rabbis over God.
Well, welcome to being Jewish for the last 1,800 years. This is how we are. I mean, this is how we decide. This is what we've been.
But we believe in the Torah, we believe in God's word.
So we do, so I want to make clear that the authority the rabbis have is of interpretation, right? They can't nullify what God says. But as any legal scholar, anyone who studies the philosophy of law will tell you, you have the basic law, like the Constitution. And then you have the active laws, like the codes and statutes and everything. And so you have a body who may be empowered to write law, like a legislature, which we don't have a legislature in Judaism. God is the legislator, and the Torah is the legislation. But in terms of who's responsible for determining what the law means, right? So for example, we read in the book of Deuteronomy, inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. That's what the Torah says. Well, what does that mean? God doesn't specify what God meant when God says, inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. We rely upon the rabbis to interpret those in keeping with what they understand the direction and messaging of that law to be, but they decide what that looks like.
It's gonna be a mezuzah.
It's gonna be a mezuzah, and it's gonna be on the right-hand side as you're entering the doorway at about eye level, tilted inward for reasons about, but all of that is rabbinic. Right? And so that's what the rabbis are there to do, right? And the point is that once God has promulgated the law, and in the instance of the, in a different conversation, we can be talking about how, and I talked this a few months ago, that most laws are open to a variety of interpretations, right? And some laws are, what their rabbis call a 49-49 decision, where 100 people look at it, and 49 might lean this way, and 49 might lean that way, and you need a way to decide what is the halakha, right? When Rabbi Shammai says that we should light 9 candles on the first night of Hanukkah, down to 2 nights on the second, like, that's not wrong. It's not wrong, it's just not how we decide as a group to move forward. And the point of the story of Achnai is that the authority to decide how we as a group are going to move forward rests with the rabbis in a majoritarian fashion.
If I just got, say, my people understood, or whatever they said.
Because what God has realized is that he created these people to think this way. He taught them this. God taught them this way, and they realized that they were able to sneak, to pick God's pocket and wrest this interpretive decision. And they did it using the reasoning that God gave us, right? It's very specific when it says, right? Why does it say it's not in heaven in Deuteronomy 30? Well, it's after a majority to incline, because in Exodus 23, God referenced a majority of the people. It's based on those words of God that the rabbis concluded, as long as the majority think it's this way, this is how God intended it to be, right? What they are saying is God intended for us to act as a majoritarian institution, and once we know that, God can no longer have the power to disagree with it.
Interesting.
And that's how the rabbis have operated for the last 1800 years or so, and continue to. Judy. Judy, you're still on mute. We can't hear you yet. Interrupt me later if you figure it out. All right. I couldn't help but spend time on that one because it is such a critique, Susan, of this long-standing, cuts to the heart of the rabbinic tradition, midrash, right? And the story of Achnai is in some ways a midrash itself, right? It comes from the Talmud, but it's essentially a midrashic interpretation of the verses, Lo b'shamayim, mean not in the heavens, and the idea of calling upon the majority. That story in the Talmud is essentially a midrash teaching us how we should understand those verses. And the conclusion is that once the Torah was given and it was accepted by a majority of the rabbis, now the rabbis get to decide what the interpretation is. Judy, I see you're with us now.
Yes, my niece wanted to get a get from her husband.
Mhm.
And it went on for a very long time. And in the end, he blackmailed her.
Yep.
He said, I'll give you the get, but you have to pay for my my medical insurance for a year. And
Yes.
she did that because she wanted to be divorced from him. Is that kosher?
This is exactly what's going on in this midrash when she says on the slide, yes, he piled conditions onto my get, right? Is it kosher? Halachically, yes. Yes, this situation the situation the rabbis created gives the husband ultimate authority in deciding when he is satisfied enough to give a get. And that situation is ripe for extortion, right? Which is what, blackmail is an example of, right? This is why, by the way, in the conservative movements, the ketubas that most of the conservative rabbis use have a clause known as the Lieberman clause, written by Rabbi Saul Lieberman, who was a leader of the movement a generation ago, where the husband agrees to hand over get issuing authority to the Beit Din of the conservative movement.
Oh, whoa.
Right, so if you get married by a conservative rabbi using that clause, what you agree to is that if either party asks for a get, the Beit Din of the conservative movement is empowered to write a get on the husband's behalf. The Orthodox community doesn't necessarily recognize the legality of that. Because what they say is you can't give up your natural right.
What about foreign?
We don't worry about it in the first place. I mean, the number of, I encourage couples when they're working through a divorce to have a ritualized way to close their marriage. The problem with the get in the first place is that it does speak to a non-egalitarian nature of marriage. So we have another document called the order of separation that is much more we mutually agree to dissolve our marriage. It doesn't have a halachic standing, and as a Reform rabbi who lives in the modern world, I'm always of two minds, because I think it's fairly reasonable that a person who gets married by a Reform rabbi and who is guided through the divorce by a Reform rabbi and who uses that document may turn around in the next part of their life and meet someone who wants to get married and want to have a wonderful wedding with the conservative rabbi, but the conservative rabbi is going to say, well, you need to get a get, right? So there's different standards here, and so there's a little bit of, and this is what I would counsel a couple in divorcing to say, listen, that you could do it this way or you could do it that way, and you have to decide what you'd rather want to do in the future. So there's a little bit of meeting in the middle there. But sometimes, it just depends, right? I mean, a few years ago, I was asked to sit on a Beit Din at the conservative synagogue where they were delivering a get to a woman. She was getting her get because she was getting remarried, and she was perfectly amicable with her ex-husband, who, they'd been divorced for a number of years, but he had no problem going through the rigmarole of having that happen, and it allowed her to marry the man that she wanted to marry in the coming months, and it worked out just fine. So, it's a little bit of pastoral and a little bit of rabbinic as to what the way to navigate that is. So, anyway, moving forward, we're gonna move away from the laws of divorce and move back to the story of Bitya, the daughter of God. Anyone know who's known as Bitya in our tradition? Pharaoh's daughter. Good, Susan. Pharaoh's daughter, who rescued Moses. So here we go, Exodus chapter 2, verses 5-6.
All these years of being Torah.
And Pharaoh's daughter went down to bathe in the Nile, and her maidens were there walking along the Nile, and she saw the ark in the reeds and sent her slave girl and took it. And she opened it and she saw the child, and it was a young lad crying. And she took pity on him and said, this is a child of the Hebrews. Okay, she is not referred to as Bitya or Batya in the book of Exodus. She is referenced by that name in the book of First Chronicles. And these are the children of Bitya, the daughter of Pharaoh. Okay, so we're having some biblical texts that are opening the conversation. Lo, so we have a text from Exodus about the story of Bitya pulling Moses out of the river. We have a reference to Bitya, the daughter of Pharaoh, in Chronicles. And now we have this verse from Isaiah. Lo, this is the fast I desire. Open the manacles of evil, untie the ropes of the yoke, let the oppressed go free and break every yoke. Share your bread with the hungry and the wretched poor. Take them into your home. If you see someone naked, clothe them, and do not ignore your own flesh. From Isaiah chapter 58. Anyone know when we read parts of that chapter, what that's the Haftarah for? Well, the first sentence kind of gives it away. This is the fast that I desire. When do we fast?
Oh, yeah.
On Yom Kippur. So on Yom Kippur, we read the earlier verses where Isaiah says, is this the fast that I desire? Right? While we are in the middle of fasting and negating ourselves, we read a prophet that says, God doesn't care whether you eat or not. What does God want you to do? Break the manacles of evil, untie the ropes of the yoke, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, take care of the poor, be Emma Lazarus, the poet who wrote the poem on the Statue of Liberty, who of course was inspired by Isaiah because she was Jewish. Okay, so Bitya, the daughter of Pharaoh in First Chronicles, Pharaoh's daughter or God's daughter. Bitya is another formulation of Bat-ya. Bat, of course, we know means daughter, and Ya is one of the names of God. So this woman who's a daughter of Pharaoh has a name ascribing her to the name of God. Why is that interesting?
It's a Hebrew name.
It's a Hebrew name first and foremost. And Steve, I would say yes, and at least it's the name that we, the Hebrews, ascribe to her, but it's how we're referring to her. All right, so it's a Hebrew name we've given her. What else? She could be the daughter of God, right? It's possible. We don't have other references. Now,
What she does, she became the daughter of God.
She-
And she was the daughter of God,
so Judah says that her action leads her to be the daughter of God. I think I see the trajectory you're going in. Give me 2 more sentences to explain it.
I can't.
You can, right? So can I suggest that maybe the idea of rescuing Moshe Rabbeinu and, you know, the greatest prophet of the Jewish people, that is a divine act? Okay, so there's that possibility that her act was an act of God and she becomes a daughter of God.
But the Pharaoh named her.
Pharaoh may have named her Bitya or Batya, if we know. I mean, again, we don't know the origin of the name. The only origin of the name is that it's this Hebrew book, the Book of Chronicles, that refers to her with this name.
So I think when she was born, God had a hand.
So maybe God had a hand in it. There's also some wonderful wordplay and also a little bit of a joke going on.
Well, that she's actually the daughter of Pharaoh.
She's the daughter of Pharaoh. And how did Pharaoh refer to Pharaoh's son?
How did Pharaoh
Refer to,
He was the king.
he was the king, but not just the king. He's a god. Pharaoh is the god. I am the heaven and the earth, the sun and the moon. So the irony is that referring to her as the daughter of Pharaoh in the mind of Pharaoh makes her the daughter of God. But she's not that God.
Yeah.
So this is all the fun parts that we're going to play with in this midrash.
Okay.
Well, the midrash teaches, she took herself out from under her father's authority, right? Because what did Pharaoh say about the Hebrewish boys? To kill them all. And that was her responsibility, right? I don't care that you're Pharaoh's daughter. Caesar's wife must be above reproach, and same for Pharaoh's daughter. She should be the first one drowning the baby in the Nile. But she pitied the boy. And even though she knew her father commanded it, every newborn boy, you will cast into the Nile, chapter 1, verse 22. The Holy Blessed One said, she who took pity on my child will be my daughter. And that is what it says, Bitya. And how does pity happen? Well, go and see what the prophet Isaiah learned from the deeds of Bitya, Pharaoh's daughter. And she saw and did not look away. As it is written, if you see someone naked, clothe them, and don't ignore your own flesh. Just as Isaiah commanded us to see, she saw. And she sent her slave girl, and did not shutter the blinds of her heart, as it is written, send the oppressed free in Isaiah. And she took the ark, the basket, and did not fear for her own life, and say, what has he to do with me, as it is written? And the wretched poor, take them into your home. Isaiah 58, chapter 6, verse 6. And she opened her heart to a foreign child, and did not say, he isn't one of ours. As it is written, open up the manacles of Eve. Right? So we see this beautiful use of the midrashic idea of taking two, in this case, 3 different pieces, ironically, from the full Tanakh. One from Torah, one from Nevi'im, and one from Ketuvim, and smashing them together to create a beautiful teaching. The verses from Exodus chapter 1 and 2 about drowning the boys, and then what the daughter of Pharaoh did. The verses from Isaiah 58, 6 and 7, verses from the prophets, and then inspired by the end by a verse from the book of Chronicles, the very last book in the Hebrew Bible, which ascribes this name Bitya to the daughter of Pharaoh. So she, right, and here's where another beautiful element of midrashim comes into play. This is suggesting that Pharaoh's daughter in the book of Exodus was inspired by the teachings from the prophet Isaiah. Now, Isaiah's teachings are very inspiring, right? We listen to them all the time. They're great teachings. What's the problem with with Pharaoh's daughter ascribing her action to the prophet Isaiah?
Time.
Time. Steve, say more.
That's right.
Isaiah is way after the beginning of Torah.
Yeah, Moses was born probably somewhere in the 14th century BCE. And depending which version of Isaiah, in Isaiah 58, we know to be the second Isaiah, he was living during the time of the exile. They're 800 years apart. 800 years later, right? So we're saying that the daughter of Pharaoh was inspired by words of the prophet Isaiah that were written 800 years later. It makes perfect sense to me. I'll tell you why it does.
Yes.
Who is able to know of a prophecy from God 800 years before it was given? God and who else? Perhaps a daughter of God.
Oh, wow.
If not her, then nobody. But again, this is the beauty of the rabbinic play is there's no before and there's no after. Torah has already existed. The prophecies that God gave to Isaiah in chapter 58, and if we're assuming it's second Isaiah during the exile, those were things that God knew before the creation. God was going to reveal to Isaiah, and Isaiah was going to share because God knows everything even before it's shared. There's no reason that God couldn't imbue some of that wisdom into God's daughter if Bithia is in fact God's daughter.
A lot of assumptions.
It's a lot of substance, right? It's a lot of substance. So we have these things. She saw, she sent, she took, she opened. And she saw him, the child. And she saw again, right? So she sees the baby coming down the river. She sees him again. She saw again, and she returned and looked in his eyes, as it is said, if you see him naked, clothe him. Now, when did she see him again? Taken out of the water. And then what happens?
Oh,
He's
then he
living
goes to
there.
his natural mother.
He goes to his natural mother, Yocheved, but then what happens?
Then he goes back to the,
Then he goes back and he grows up in the house of Pharaoh and all that kind of, and then what happens?
then then he hears God.
Then he slays one of the slave drivers and he runs away and he has his call from God at the burning bush and he rallies, and then what happens eventually decades later? Whose house does he show up in? Pharaoh's house. And who's sitting right there? Bithia. Oh, he's back. Excuse me, in this very different role.
Now, as I remember reading it, Moses was 80 when he was.
Yeah, if he lives to be 120, yeah.
Okay, and how much older would Bithia be at this point?
Well, she was old enough to have been an adult to make this decision at the time. But if we think about the fact, it's a fair question, right? So Bithia's father is Pharaoh, not her grandfather.
Okay,
Because if her grandfather was still alive, then he would be Pharaoh, right? So her father is Pharaoh. She is sibling to the Pharaoh that we often refer to as Ramses, although we don't really know if it's Ramses. I mean, that's conjecture. That's Cecil B. DeMille more than anything else, right? The Pharaoh who is the one who enslaved and oppressed, and the Pharaoh in whose household as a brother to whom Moses raised is unnamed in Torah, as is the sister, right? The name Bithia only comes from later on, from the book of Chronicles. So she's a sister to the brother who Moses grows up as a brother, right? So it's probably a multiple decade family, right? Because obviously she's old enough to have some wherewithal,
Yeah.
but young enough that her brother could be his brother, right? Whether she is older than her younger brother who becomes Pharaoh, obviously we know in his patriarchal system that, we can presume that she may have been the heir presumptive when she was born, but her younger brother became the heir apparent when he was born, that the boys inherited before the girls. So she could be the older sister to the younger brother, who's the older brother to Moses.
Okay,
But they're of one generation. She's probably a late teen, early 20s.
She could have been 15.
She could have been 15, she could have been 22. Who knows? We don't really know. But she's of that generation.
they never say anything about her children, her
No.
natural children.
She didn't say anything about it.
And she doesn't matter, she's a woman.
Yeah,
I mean, in keeping with the teachings of the presumption of the midrashim, her story is irrelevant. She's the sister who doesn't count. We have a few of those in the tradition. All right. Except now we're gonna make her count. The Holy Blessed One, by the way, you'll notice that, so these are not my translations, these are translations in the Dirshuni collection, right? There is this phrase in Hebrew, very, very common in the rabbinic tradition, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right, is one of the ways that God is often referred to. HaKadosh, Kadosh means holy, so HaKadosh, the Holy One, Baruch, blessed, who? Him, he, him. So Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be he, right? Which is the typical way that phrase is translated in a traditional rabbinic mindset. If you look at the translation of the story of the oven of Achnai, we see here at the end, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at that time? He said, the Holy Blessed be he said, my children have triumphed, my children have triumphed. Okay, this translation is a faithful translation to the Aramaic Hebrew text of the Talmud and takes no consideration for gender. It translates it as is. My custom, our custom here at Bethel, is to degenderize the translation because it's unnecessary, and we often refer to as this the Holy One of Blessing, or the Holy One be blessed, or as we see in the way that the translators, for the same reasons, in Dirshuni, the Holy Blessed One. Holy Blessed One, Holy One of Blessing, kind of the same thing. But noticing that even in translation, you can either lean into the patriarchy, lean into the gender, or you can say, Moses can be he, but God doesn't need to be. And we can reframe it. Unless you want to go even farther, a digression. Tamar Biala, who was the main editor of Dirshuni, is currently involved with another project called Torah. Okay, what is Torah? Torah is a project to invert the gender of the entire Torah.
She,
Why?
Because you learn something. If we start with the presumption that, we have spent time in this community challenging ourselves to see God as neither male nor female. What if God becomes female? And all of the dominant voices in Torah become female. And all of the non-dominant voices in Torah become man. How does that expand our understanding of what's right and what's wrong? Right? It's another act of Midrash. They're not changing the Torah, they're giving us another way to look at it. And you can pull interesting things about it, but it reads different and it sounds different because they invert the gender. And when you invert the gender, now all the vowels, all the verbs get turned around. So for example, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. Okay? That is in the masculine. Ve'ahaft et Adonai Elohayich. Just turn it around, right? Maybe not so much to learn from that one. But other interesting places, there's what to learn from it. And so it's a long project they're working on. They've recently gotten started, but it's very thoughtful. So the Holy Blessed One said to Pharaoh's daughter, you, with the Torah of kindness on your lips, and your mouth opened with wisdom, taught my sons and my daughters the secret opening of the heart. As it is written, and she opened. Who taught the gaze that sees in the child the lad that he will become. As it is written, and she saw him. And the child, it was as a young lad, and you taught the secret of listening to the weeping of foreign children. As it is written, this is the child of the Hebrews. You will be taken in under my wings, and you will be a daughter to me, and your name in Israel will be Bit Yah. So this is a midrash explaining how it came to be, that in a much later book, and why it came to be, that God ascribed this Hebrewish name, the daughter of Pharaoh Bit Yah, because, to answer Judith, your interpretation, it's not that she was born a daughter to God, she became a daughter to God in her ability to bring Torah to life, especially this most important Torah, which comes from the prophet Isaiah, to see the foreign child, to open your eyes, to open your ears, to open your heart. But wait, there's more. And not only that, but the Holy Blessed One commanded her and said, go and teach that secret of compassion to all who come into this world, you who rebelled against the idols of your father's house, the idols of racism. There may be no more powerful message than a daughter of the king choosing to violate her father's own decrees, especially when that decree is an unjust one, in the name of justice. Beautiful. The heroine of the story. Right. It would be an interesting thing to look at next year's Seder table. There's only one problem with that. The story of Moses and the Nile in the basket isn't in the Seder at all. Moses does not appear once in the Seder.
Right.
That's right. You know why? The rabbis were fearful of us worshiping Moses. And so who is the hero of the Exodus? God. And not Moses in the rabbinic mind. The rabbinic mind takes it out of the hands of the humans who do the things and makes it about God. The story of taking Moses out of the Seder is a good example. When we see the story of Hanukkah and its evolution through it, it goes from being the Maccabees who performed, right, and who were victorious, to God causing that to happen, the miracle that God performed at this season and for our people in this time. It gets even more pronounced in the story of Esther, right? We say the same blessing, who perform miracles for our ancestors in this time in this season of their time. That's the same blessing that we say for the Hanukkah candles, and we say for the reading of the Megillah, right? Ascribing credit to God for what happened to the Jews in Shushan. Here's the irony. How many times has God appeared in the story of Esther? None. God's name does not appear. It's the only book of the Bible in which God's name does not appear. So the rabbis, in a book that doesn't mention God once, give God all the credit for what happened, and we bless it later on. Because the rabbis are trying to move all of our theology in and around God.
To idolize.
Right. That's just an aside.
Interesting.
All right. We have 12 minutes left for the giving of the 10 Commandments. The Giving of the 10 Commandments by Tamar Biala, who's the editor of the volume. This is the story of a young woman who was sitting in synagogue when the 10 Commandments were being read. The reader was chanting so expertly that the young woman thought that she were hearing them for the first time. And she was astonished at what she heard because her heart became aggrieved. She asked her heart, what is the nature of Zachor the Shabbat, that you should remember the Sabbath to hallow it? Of which it is said, you shall do no work, you and your son and your daughter, your male slave and your slave girl and your beast and your sojourner who is within your gates. And his wife, what about her? Is she not also commanded to hallow the Sabbath? And what is the nature of you shall not covet, of which it is said, you shall not covet your fellow man's wife, or his male slave, sorry, it's a male slave, it's a typo, or his slave girl, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything the fellow man has. What about his wife? What about her? Did the Torah not command her too, not to covet that which is her fellow woman's? So she hears these 10 commandments, and this is where the Torah project is so interesting, because there are places in Torah when it's written in the plural. But even that, it's the plural masculine form, which is understood to be everybody. But there are places when the language is decidedly singular and male. Zachor et hashabat is a command form, second person, masculine, singular. Right? Hebrew is a gender language, not only in pronouns, but also in the way that the verbs are conjugated and how the adjectives are applied. And so she's asking, why do these texts appear to be speaking only to men? The young woman was pious and did not until that day had a single foreign musing or doubt regarding the truth of Torah. At that moment of questioning, her heart was wrapped in fear, beating until she thought of everyone in the synagogue could hear its rhythm. The tears that rose in her throat had the taste of the deep, a taste of the sea that drowned the Egyptians. And she was shaking and aghast, and her soul fled. Her whole theology is breaking down around her. She's drowning in fear, literally. The Holy Blessed One gathered her up, her soul in the palm of his hand. This is their translation, his hand, and was looking and smiling at her. He said to her, "How long have I waited for you to come and to ask me, so that I might reveal to you which has been hidden away from me for 3,000 years? I was waiting for someone to wonder why the mitzvot are written only for men." She cast her eyes downward and said, "Did the Holy One not speak to women at Mount Sinai and not command them the same things he commanded to men with thunder and lightning?" The Holy One lifted up her head and said, "When Moses ascended, I commanded him, and have them make themselves ready for the third day, them. For on the third day, God will come down before all the people on Mount Sinai." Since Moses distanced himself from women, as he separated from Zipporah, he brought only men near the mountain, as it said, and he brought only men near the mountain, as it said, and Moses brought the people toward God from the camp. So in verse 11, God says it's for everybody, but Moses decides that abstinence, both physical and also just proximal, was necessary. God did not go near women, Moses did not go near women, he avoided his wife. And so from that, we can understand that Moses brought only the men forward to hear the revelation. At that time, when Moses heard the commandments, there were only men around him. He heard, "You shall do no work." And he said to himself, "And who shall be punished for doing the work if not the man? And whose are the slaves and the slave girls, the chattel and the children, whom he can command to do rest or work if not the man's?" Right? The men are commanded, the men have authority over the children, over the slaves, over the slave girls, over the beasts. So in Moses' mind, only the men need to hear this. And so Moses bade the men to keep the Sabbath in the masculine pronoun. And because he was not me'urav, im habriot, me'urav means mixed up, im habriot with all of the created ones, all the people. By the way, briot is feminine, right? The briot, the created beings is a feminine noun in the gender binary language of Hebrew. And Moses was not me'urav im habriot. Moses was not mixed up with the people, mixed up with the women, the text would suggest. For he had not been mixed up with his wife Zipporah for a long time. He did not remember that women too have desire. And so he did not include them in the prohibition not to covet. I'm not going to make presumptions about any of the women in this room, or any single woman for that matter, but we should not presume that women don't also have feelings, including romantic feelings, including perhaps erotic feelings, including temptation to covet. And it is not an act of chivalry to assume that women don't have those urges. It's a denial of their humanity. This is what's teaching us. The young woman asked the Holy One of Blessing, Judy, I see your hand, let me finish, the Midrash will come back to you. The young woman asked the Holy One of Blessing, if so, and Moses, who separated from women, could not hear those words which the Holy One of Blessing ordained for them, will a sage who has not separated himself to be able to hear? Right? If Moses didn't understand, how is it possible that the sage be able to? And the Holy One's countenance became grave. God's face fell, and he answered her thus: any Beit Midrash that has no women, my voice, my word, will not emerge from their whole. This in some ways ties back to the Avad Avachanai, right? God is saying, my word is complete. My word is my word is my word is my word. My word includes all of the people, all of the genders. But any Beit Midrash, a place where rabbis come to study, that doesn't have female voices, their understanding of it is not whole. And so those majoritarian opinions inspired by the story of the Avad Avachanai, if they don't include the voice of women, in God's mind, are not complete. This is an indictment of the rabbinic tradition that has excluded women's voices for thousands and thousands of years. That no God would have wanted women's voices out of the story. In fact, God would have wanted voices in the story. Judy, you saw your hand first a moment ago. You got to unmute first, though. Let's see if we can do that more easily this time.
Nope.
Judy, you got to unmute first. We can't hear you. If you hold the space bar, you can probably talk. No, not yet. Click on the Zoom menu window and then hold the space bar. Maybe that'll work.
Okay,
There we go. Go ahead.
okay. If everybody had to wait so long for Judith Plaskow to write her book, Return to Sinai, maybe it would have moved a little quicker. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is the next, Judith Plaskow, brilliance, and speaks to and for the most part, the progressive part of the Jewish community, the non-Orthodox community, right? The women who wrote these are Orthodox, some of them, right? This isn't meant to be for an Orthodox audience. Whether or not it's going to resonate, probably not. But we are seeing in our time, on the edges, that the border between women being able to carry the title of rabbi or rabbah or whatever, there are Orthodox communities that are becoming more and more open to the idea of women's voices in a meaningful way. It's not mainstream yet, but it's happening. So, but you're right, Judith Plaskow, and there are plenty of who come after her, Rachel Adler. We are planning, by the way, in the month of June to celebrate some of the thinkers of our time, including Judith Plaskow and Rachel Adler, as for some of our theme Shabbatot for the summer. So look forward to that in July and August. So, any last remarks? Any last reflections? Well done.
Fascinating, thank you.
The book Dirshuni is available at all major booksellers, including Amazon and bookshop.org.
Thank you.
Probably not at Barnes and Noble locally.
Thank you for.
Yeah, that's very thank you.
We will look forward in 2 months to starting it again.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Good job.